Classes in session.
Hey, how you doing? Welcome to Unlearn 16 Classes in Session. You just got me today, guys. Just me, myself, and a lot of pent-up anger. What I'm going to talk about today has actually been going on in Ontario, Canada right now, and it's kind of popped off in the last week, even though it has been building steam for quite some time. And obviously I'm on social media a lot, sort of running my mouth as I tend to do. And I've been over on TikTok because I love it there. And of course I go over to Twitter, and Twitter's a very different animal. It's a very angry animal. It's not for the faint of heart. So let me first break you into what's going on in Ontario regarding teachers and regarding educational workers. And then I'm going to go through my perspective, sort of the anger that has hit me, and then what I think the solutions are. So here we go. First and foremost, what's happening in Ontario is that educational support workers under the union CUPE, so we're talking about educational assistants, ECEs, we're talking about administrative staff, janitorial staff, all of the educational support workers, everybody but teachers who are in a different union altogether, and that's a bit of a problem in my opinion, but are a different union altogether. They have been bargaining with the Ontario government for quite some time and have come to no resolution. They had a vote in their union, which is policy, and they got a very substantial strike mandate. And what that means is, if as a union, you're able to go on strike, you need to have a significant body of your electorate, of your union itself, vote to go on strike. So they have that. I can't remember the numbers, so I don't want to say them on here, but they had a significant strike mandate. Now, they demanded X amount. The government came back with nothing. To be honest, I think the very first problem is that the public is aware of what's going on behind closed doors at all. So the first and foremost problem is the fact that when you are collectively bargaining, which is a charter right in Canada, so it's a constitutional right in Canada, when you're collectively bargaining, it is supposed to be done in good faith. And when you say things are done in good faith, it's not supposed to go to the media. It's not supposed to be public knowledge. We shouldn't be talking about 11%. We shouldn't be talking about infrastructure spending as the public. We shouldn't know any of that. But somehow we always do. And it usually is the government releasing this information, which I don't understand how that happens and how that's allowed to happen. But, bygones. Let's move on from that. So the demands were made. The strike mandate was set. The government didn't want to budge. The union reduced how much money they wanted. Everybody was done. The union said, we're striking. So the Ford government, in an insane move, decided to vote and invoke something called in Canada the notwithstanding clause. And without getting into it so incredibly specifically, because it is confusing, think about it like this. In 1982, when Canada created its own constitution, prior to that, we followed the British constitutional framework. But in 1982, we created and passed our own under Pierre Trudeau. Yes, Justin Trudeau's dad. And in that moment, a lot of provinces, a few key provinces, didn't want to sign on to this new charter because they thought that this charter and these federal regulations could discriminatorily impact specific provinces more than another. Let me give you an example. So if I said something like, there is, the entire country is bilingual and everything has to be done bilingually. Well, Quebec could raise a question and raise a constitutional question stating that as a French province, and especially when they signed on to the Constitution, as a French province, they have to protect their French language rights. And we have given them credit to do so. So this kind of overarching charter right might start to discriminatorily, individually supersede their language rights in their province. And therefore they might use, and have used, Quebec has used the notwithstanding clause 21 times, and might use it to protect the federal government from particularly intruding upon their province in a specific way. Another province who could have a problem with the charter or with these kind of things would be Alberta, because Alberta obviously has a lot of our natural resources. So when it comes to distribution of money or distribution of wealth, Alberta could have a disproportional sort of need to protect a resource that Ontario doesn't have, right? Different provinces have different needs and they have different things they're bringing to the table. So I understand the notwithstanding clause being used in that framework. Doug Ford didn't do that. This has nothing to do with the federal government imposing anything. This has to do with a labor dispute within his province, a legal labor dispute, a legal strike action taking place. And because he knows he can't legislate it around it, by the way, the last time this happened, Kathleen, I think in 2015, legislated teachers back to work. And later teachers took her to court and won a constitutional argument saying she never had the power to do so and they had to pay a bunch of money. So Ford's people know this. I'm sure Ford doesn't know this, but Ford's people know this. So he has to take a different route. So what does he do? Well, he doesn't legislate. There's no simple law. He uses this very, very seldomly used notwithstanding clause and applies it in a completely asinine way. And applies it and says you have to go back to work. Now, have they gone back to work? No. They all went on strike on Friday. Everybody walked out. And everybody is upset. So, first and foremost, I go onto social media, obviously defending two things. Defending the incredible importance of EAs and ECEs, in defending the importance of obviously custodial staff and janitorial staff and all of those individuals, defending the importance of a strong administrative body that runs schools and makes everything run smooth. All of those things are necessarily important. And EAs for a very long time, and I'm going to get to something that EAs do, but EAs for a very long time have been significantly underpaid, and not just underpaid because they do such an amazing job. And I'm comparing, what their pay is compared to what they do. Underpaid because that's how the government has set it up. Because they've done the same kind of crap in the healthcare industry. Let me be clear. So, back in the day, we used to have streaming, right? We used to have kids with different learning abilities, different capacities, different potential, maybe with hearing impairments, visual impairments, maybe with, physical disabilities, maybe learning disabilities. And all of these kids, back in my time, yes, I am 47, they would have been put in another room. They would have put in lower academic classes. They never would have been integrated into the sort of regular stream classes. They would have been segregated and said, we have to deal with them over here because the standard streaming can't deal with all of those exceptionalities. In the last, I would say, 20 years, longer since, but really in the last 20 years, we've seen a significant push away from that. Understanding a few things. Understanding that just because a kid doesn't learn in the static way that the educational system has been set up, i.e. sit down, take notes, write notes, eventually memorize them all, and then regurgitate it on a test and exam. Just because a kid can't perform in that capacity does not mean they're not intelligent, does not mean they're not capable, and does not mean that they don't have a firm grasp on the information and the level of education that they should have a firm grasp on in order to do well in that class and move on. So in the last 20 years, we've come to a lot of different sort of acknowledgments, different learning styles and different learning capacities, right? You'll hear people who are auditory learners, visual learners, who are bodily kinesthetic learners, all these different kind of learners. Now, can we accommodate for them all? Absolutely, we can't. I get it, we can't. Can we accommodate for more? Yes, we can. Absolutely, we can. If a kid can't sit down and write a test for some reason or another, whatever the processing difficulty is, yet can stand in front of me and talk about World War II with the depth and level of articulation that would be, impressive to anybody, why wouldn't that kid get the mark? Why wouldn't that kid be understood? And why wouldn't that student be passed and be given good marks and decent marks in order to go ahead and be successful. There's no reason. The only reason in the past was the standard answer. This is how we do it. And if you can't do it the way we do it, you're not right. So a lot of those kids back in the day, and a lot of people are wondering, why is it so different? Well, I'll tell you why it was different. Because 20, 30 years ago, those kids were kicked out of school. Those kids would fail out of school. Those kids would be deemed to be problem kids, troubled kids. Those kids would be, people would make assumptions about their level of intelligence and capacity and relegate them to open courses. They are never going to college. They are never going to university. We had done a huge disservice to a whole bunch of kids. And I sometimes sit back and I wonder how many geniuses we lost. I wonder how many brilliant kids we actually let slip through the cracks and ignored, not even slip through the cracks, actually kicked out the door because we didn't have a system that could accommodate and that could change and that could be a little bit more fluid in its application of education. I wonder that. And now we have a money problem. So back in the day, they were in separate places. And at some point in the mid 70s to pushing the 80s, we started realizing that individuals with different abilities, back then it was called a disability, but with different abilities, had the potential, had the capacity to do better and to do more. And in order to see how they were going to work in this world, it made sense academically to integrate them into mainstream classes. And when we did that in high school, there's one effect. When we did that in elementary school, we had a problem. Because some of these kids, either socially, physically, sometimes mentally, couldn't quite integrate quick enough or well enough or smooth enough. And so educational assistants were put into that classroom in order to help improve their chances of becoming successful. Now, there's two reasons we did that. We did that to help the kids get successful. Absolutely, we did. I think there's also a motivation here, an underlying motivation that did this. We also wanted a good teacher to student ratio. Now, teachers in Ontario have been paid very well. I'll be the first person to say that. I think they deserve every cent, but they have been paid very well. And a union and the fight of a union has been a big reason for that. Now, if I'm going to put 20, 25, 30 kids in a class with no exceptionalities, that's not that hard as a teacher. Are you with me so far? It's not that hard to regulate that kind of class, to teach that kind of class, to understand that everybody's going to be on the same page and I can have one learning style and one set of expectations and I don't need to adjust. I don't need to accommodate. I don't need to change my methodology for anybody in that room. But as soon as I start integrating into that class, as soon as I start having different exceptionalities, kids that are battling through autism, kids that are dyslexic, kids that are visually impaired, hearing impaired, all of those things, by the way, do not, in no way, shape, or form, limit the level of intelligence or capacity in that student. But what will limit the level of capacity is how much we are willing to accommodate and shape a system in order to get the best out of them. Now, the public system doesn't want to hire more teachers. Why? Well, we're expensive. That makes sense. They don't want to have fewer kids in a classroom. As you guys all might know, I work in a private school. I teach kids with different learning abilities. I teach kids that are on the spectrum with dyslexia, with all of these things. Yet I have class sizes that are 10, 15 students. So what I can do is I can do all those magical things that a lot of teachers can do if their class sizes were small enough. If they're not, and you have 20, 25, 30 kids in a class, then you need help. You need help to help the students who aren't necessarily on the exact same path as everybody else. You need help. They need help in order to bring them up to speed, to make them feel confident, to make them feel empowered, to give them a fighting chance to be successful in the ways that you need them to be successful in. So all of this is true. But the brilliance they did with EAs is they did this. They told EAs they need less education than a typical teacher would. And since they needed less education, they would be paid less. Since we were going to slightly change their expectations, they wouldn't have the same pay grade. This is a brilliant way to put more adults in the room who are completely capable and amazing and dedicated to those students. But one of those adults we can pay as the public board 50% less, 60% less in some cases. So it's a way you save money, right? And I often look at these EAs and what they do and how amazing they are. And by the way, I haven't even got to, and I'm not going to speak to it in depth because I don't have as much experience, but I haven't even got to the physical job they have. The Ontario government has just downloaded more healthcare responsibilities to EAs. So they have to deal with kids that have physical outbursts, that have other issues, health issues, and I'm not going to go into all of them right here, but other health issues that should be held or should be dealt with by healthcare professionals, but they're not. They're now being downloaded to the EAs. The EAs getting more work, and now the EAs and now this group of people are starting to demand to be paid more. And it's not just pay, by the way. There was a whole list of demands, again, which we shouldn't have seen during negotiations that seemed relatively rational to me. So all this comes to a head. And my first and the response by the Ford government is they're essential. They're essential. How dare they, right? After COVID and after all this, how dare they keep kids out of the room? They don't care about kids. They don't care about kids. And the Ford government keeps pushing this agenda. My initial response is make them essential. A lot of people don't understand this. Nurses are essential. Firefighters are essential. Police officers are essential. Why? Well, they were made essential and they're all unionized, which means they cannot strike. Because if they went on strike, the power they could wield and the dangers would be physical, right? Life and death dangers, physical dangers that they could wield. And that's way too much power for a union to have. But here's the trade-off. Since they can't strike, what happens is when, let's say when nurses can't come to a contract negotiation conclusion with management, an arbitrator is called in. And this arbitrator will sit down, will look at both sides of the equation, look at what's being asked, look at what management wants. They will then look at precedent and labor law, and then they will apply a fair and just contract. Why not do that with educational workers? Some people would say, well, it's not life and death, Joanna. That's not the case here. And it needs to be life and death. However, have we not spent the last 2 years, the government anyways, professing that it is? Have we not spoken about how kids being out of school is actually such a significant mental health crisis that kids' lives were being lost? And if that's the case, can we not now make teachers essential and educational workers essential? This is an essential part. Mental health is an essential part of our physical well-being. It is life and death. So why can't we make that so? I'll tell you why they don't want to make it so. And there's one really good reason. Because the government would lose. Calling in an arbitrator would mean that the government and what they're offering is so bare bones that the arbitrator would never agree with the government. And the government doesn't want to roll that dice, so they won't even consider making them essential and going through this kind of constitutional arrangement that we would have to change the nature of education. Well, maybe now's the time. Maybe now's the time. I will not sit here and say what a person's job is valued at. That's an incredibly difficult, very, very difficult thing to do. And a lot of people outside of it are very quick to say they're not worth it. Do you know what I get paid? Whatever. And a lot of people are very quick to say that. I don't know if I can say that, but I know who can. Somebody who is an expert in that vicinity, right? An arbitrator, studied labor law, educational law, has studied precedent, understands the value of labor and how to apply that accordingly. Give the power to them. I'm okay with that. But again, I ask you, why do you think the government isn't? Right? And I sit back and I watch everybody get angry and draw comparisons. And heaven forbid, I'm not going to go into comparisons with the bouncy castle people. I can't. I can't. I supported their right to protest. Absolutely. Absolutely. I support their right to protest, but they didn't protest. They moved in. And their demand, one of their primary demands, was that the prime minister resign, a democratically elected prime minister who just was recently elected. These are not the same categories of things. But if you want me to do one on that, I will, even though I have in the past. So now we sit here, right? We sit here with people that have a fundamental disdain, which shocks me considering what it was like when they were home, kids were home for 2 years. And I thought there would have been a level of respect for what teachers actually do. But now we sit in this position where there's such a disdain. And I think the disdain is for two things. Teachers, 100%. People have had disdain for teachers. Why? Two reasons. Primarily, they've relegated us to being babysitters, which is asinine. But they're also really, really, really angry about the 2 months off in the summer. They just don't think we put in enough hours to get the pay we get. I can argue that separately. But here's another thing. I think people are really, really mad, really angry at unions. And the only people that are really angry at unions are people that are not a part of them. And I've heard a lot, I've gotten a lot of vitriol, especially on Twitter about, well, do you know what I get paid? Do you know what I go through? I don't get this, this, and this. And all I hear in my head, even though you can't have a rational discussion on Twitter very often, all I hear in my head is, dude, you're getting screwed too. You should have a union. You shouldn't be, it's like if they don't have protection, if they don't have this kind of support, if they can't enforce this kind of healthy labor law and balance of power, people are so angry they don't want anyone to be able to do it, especially when, and let's acknowledge this, especially when they do go on strike, your kids are at home. And if your kids are at home, somebody needs to stay home. And I understand the difficulty, if not impossibility of that particular situation. I get it. And again, remember, me over here, make them essential. I agree with it. Make them essential. But the union factor is interesting. And I want to talk about that for a second, because a lot of people are really bitter about unions. But let me be clear. Most of everybody else's job, whether you have if you don't have a union, is still contingent upon what the union in other professions has done and the standards they've set and the labor precedences they've set and the way that a lot of those fights have been translated into provincial and federal law. Let me give you one example. Post office workers, postal workers went on strike. Oh gosh, I'm going to mess up this year. I want to say the 80s, went on strike for 42 days or so, and they won a 17-week paternity leave. 17 weeks, they won that. Paid paternal leave, maternity, I think just at the time. And eventually what it translated into was the federal government acknowledging the need and the human right and the labor law precedent of establishing it for everybody in Canada. So you see these unions doing the hard work, not getting paid for 42 days. And we would have been so mad about our mail and so mad about the inconvenience and so mad and so mad and so mad, yet we don't understand that what they fought for, we benefited from. Let me do another one. Teachers, I work in a private school. I say that very, very clearly. The work that public school teachers have done, the benefits, the pay, everything that they have gotten translates into the private system. Why? Because if a private school doesn't acknowledge that pay, doesn't acknowledge those benefits, doesn't acknowledge those working conditions, nobody is going to work at the private school. So the private school has to mirror that if they don't want two things. A, if they want people working there, and B, if they don't want people organizing a union within their facility, which is completely legal across the country. I'll give you one more example. The same thing happens in nursing. Nurses Union has unions all over the place. Sick Kids Hospital is not unionized. But those nurses and that collective bargaining, the management and the way in which they deal with their nurses somehow mirrors and beautifully reflects what the Ontario Nurses Association fights for and gets for unionized nurses across Ontario. Sick Kids doesn't want a union. So what do? They mirror what the union has fought for. So when people say, I work in a non-unionized environment, I'm a non-unionized teacher, I don't need a union, I'm treated well. Wait a minute. You're treated well because your employer knows they have to. There's also labor law that unions have pushed in that have made these legal agreements across the province and across Canada. All of those things have happened. But it's also just more, subtle than that. It's the notion that a private school setting is going to have to mimic a public. It's going to have to make sure that those workers are treated well. And that's not just because the owners are being nice, guys. That's not just because the people that run Sick Kids Hospital want to treat their nurses well. It's because they know they have to. Because the precedent has been fought for. Blood, sweat, and tears by that union to get those rights, to get those benefits, to get those working conditions. And they now translate into non-unionized environments that are comparable. What we should have seen through this whole thing, we should have been fighting for more unionization rather than taking it away, because the number one place during COVID that was treated horrifically yet still open, grocery stores and pharmacies. All of those places still stayed open. All of those, predominantly women, predominantly, mothers and students, worked in those places with no union, with no sick days, with no benefits, with nothing. The retail industry is probably the most taken advantage of industry, period. There is no unionization across any board. And instead of advocating for if they don't get it, I don't, how about we start to understand that what we need is more solidarity through all sort of job markets, right? We've seen inflation go through the roof and people love to talk about that. But why are profits up 70%? Why, when you look at the statistics, why when you look at corporate profits over this time and they're claiming inflation and they're claiming it's just because everything costs more, why? Why have their profits risen exponentially to what they were pre-COVID? Corporate greed is a real thing. Now, when you translate all of this back, and let's get back to teachers' unions and let's get back to the EAs for a second and CUPE workers, here's where it's really problematic for people to swallow, because it's not a corporation, because it's not a private entity making money. It's government money. And what people are really upset about is their tax dollars being used inappropriately. And so a lot of people outside of the business just don't understand and don't want their tax dollars going, because we know they're limited, right? We know the province has huge debt. So there's the fight. Here's the conversation. And here's what politicians don't say well. We're going to have a pool of money. We're going to take X amount of tax dollars from you, and we're going to put it places to get jobs done. If you want more social services, if you want them to be better, and this is a simple reality, it's going to cost more. If you elect a government who reduces your taxes, the only thing that's going to happen is you are going to get less social services than you were getting before. Any government that says, I'm going to reduce your taxes and give you more, they are lying, and common sense dictates so. A lot of people, especially in Ontario, say, where are we supposed to get the money? I have an idea. How about all of the license plate sticker money? So in Ontario, every year you pay $130 to get a little sticker on your license plate. You register your car every single year. It's a tax. And that money totaled about $1 billion a year. Well, not too long ago, shockingly right before the election, Doug Ford says, I'm canceling it. I'm giving it all back. And not only did he cancel it for the year, he actually gave back pay for 2 years. That money is $1 billion a year. $1 billion. He decided to give back every Canadian that money on their sticker money. So in total, right now, that's $3 billion that was siphoned out of the tax base. And then he has the audacity to sit and say, we don't have the money. You had the money. You used it to bribe people. You used it to say, here, I'm giving you this tax money back because we're so inefficient with our money. We don't need it. We're doing great without it. Of course we're not. You cannot lower taxes and expect more out of your social services. You just can't. And when it comes to education, a lot of the vitriol I'm also receiving is, well, when I was a kid, there was 40 kids. Well, we've already gone over that. You didn't have the same kids in your class. And I'm going to take a step further. The education system was worse. I know a lot of people are saying, no, it wasn't. We did great. Look at how we're doing. You know what? First of all, different time, different place. Second of all, as a society, we get smarter and we get better. And if we can understand, I believe there are 7, there might be more now because I'm that old since I've been to teachers college, but there's 7 different learning strategies or learning mentalities. And if we can figure out how to tap into all of them, and if it costs us more money to tap into all of them, but by tapping into all of them, we are ensuring that every single student has the best possible chance for success and to show their brilliance and their capacity and their ability to then transfer those skills to higher education and in the working world, doesn't that benefit all of us? Isn't that money well spent? You want to reduce future issues of unemployment, of welfare, of healthcare needs, because we all know the lower the socioeconomic class, the greater the healthcare requirements. If we want to lower crime, we start by pouring money into education. Period. And if you say you don't want to, I get it. You can say, I want my money going somewhere else. I think you're wrong, and I would have that discussion. I think you are fundamentally wrong. Because that's where, if that is where money is poured into, if that's the only place, think of it like this, because we don't do this with healthcare either. And I think I should do an entire other podcast. And please let me know in the comments if you would like about healthcare. Education is prevention. Education isn't waiting for the problem, isn't waiting for the healthcare crisis, isn't waiting for the crime rates to go up. It isn't waiting for for adults not to have jobs and transferable skills. Education is preempting all of that. And the scary part is, it's just not clear. When we pour money in education, we just don't see all of those numbers go down equally. They will go down in a generation. And in a generation, you don't just have one politician in charge. So guess what? We as a public need to take some accountability for not voting out people with good plans for the next 20, 30, 40 years. I don't want a plan for now. A plan for now helps somebody get reelected. That's why Doug Ford gave you back your $130. A plan for the future is going to cost a lot of money, and you're not going to see the benefits for a generation. You're not going to see benefits until those kids are out of elementary school, out of high school, into college, out of college, and doing amazing things. I have my friend's kid, Charlie, who loves Elon Musk, and we have our discussions about Elon. But he points out all the time, because Charlie's bored in school. Why? Because Charlie's very, very smart. And he wants to be challenged in school. And he points out that Elon Musk talks about school isn't needed. Here's what I'm going to say. I would put money, not a lot because I don't have Elon Musk money, but I would put money on the fact that not only when Elon Musk went to school, did he go to some narrow-minded, limited version of a school in which it told him to sit down, be quiet, and write notes and memorize and write the exam. And when he didn't do well or he didn't get anything out of it, he didn't see the value of it. Elon also talks about getting beat up and bullied horribly as a kid. Of course he was. He's also talked about being on the autistic spectrum, on the autism spectrum. Of course he is. But I think a lot of people would talk about what a genius he is. So what did we do? We built a school system that made a genius have to leave. We weren't doing it right. We weren't doing it right because that guy should have wanted to be in school, should have figured out ways. We should have figured out ways to challenge and inspire and include and stop the bullying and the harassment and all of that garbage that goes, because look at what he's done. And a lot of people say, well, he did it without school. What do you think he could have done if he had school? Possibly. Could he have done more? Could he have solved bigger crises? Could he have understood more about the inner workings of Tesla? Because we all know he's a businessman. He's not necessarily he didn't invent Tesla. What else could have happened? And I sometimes think about that. I think about it a lot. I think about all of the kids, because a lot of the times we'll talk about what we've done to women and what we've done to African Americans and the indigenous population. It's all horrific, and all the doors we closed and all the people we stopped from progressing and changing the world and all of the things we could have been as a society, but we stopped people from walking through doors based on such asinine, ridiculous, horrific, discriminatory thoughts. How much further would we have been? Be selfish about it. If you want to be anything, be selfish about it. And then I apply that to learning exceptionalities. And then I apply that to forms of genius. And then I apply that to kids who just don't fit the mold. And if they don't fit the mold, we kick them out of a class and call it a day. What a disaster. How much further along would we have been had there been an EA in the classroom, had there been smaller class sizes, had there been money poured into education so we could figure out and we could focus on all 7 different learning styles in order to maximize every kid's genius out there? Where would we be? Would we have cured cancer by now? Would we have already established Mars living? Right? Would we have solved energy crisis? Would we have figured out how to eliminate levels of poverty and world hunger? But what do? We kicked those kids out. We said, you don't fit the mold. We said, oh, you just are one of 40. And if you can't figure out how to fit in, you're just going to have to stand outside the room. How many of those kids do we leave behind? And selfishly, how much did we limit our progress? How much did we limit where we could have been? I'm done limiting. I'm done. And the notion of pouring money into education, again, is about prevention and is about that's the way. It's not about structure. It's actually about blowing up structure. It's about blowing up one way only. It's about opening our eyes and encouraging as many divergent thought processes as we possibly can in order to create the smartest population on the planet. And that's going to cost money. But it's not going to happen by saying, well, my job is hard. Well, when I was a kid, this is the way it is. We have to think in the future. And in the future and for the future, we pour money into it now. We pour money into those divergent thought processes now. And we make sure as many doors can stay open as possible so as many bright, amazing geniuses can walk through and do great things. And it starts with education. Well, thanks for hanging out with me today, guys. I think maybe we talk about this a little more. Let me know in the comments if you liked it. Let me know in the comments if you have more questions about it. I'm sure that this controversy in this particular state of Ontario politics and labor relations is definitely not coming to a close anytime soon. But I think this can also be applied to healthcare. This can also be applied to many different avenues within public policy and social justice issues. But thanks for hanging out with me on your Tuesday. I will see you next week. Same bat time, same bat station. Have a good night, guys. Dismissed.